A TVA rail story, a sad tale of bureaucratic woe. Long before I went to work for the BNSF Railway Company, I got involved with rail through my TVA economic and community development work. When the Staggers Act deregulated railroads in the 1980s, Class I railroads moved rapidly to divest themselves of the less profitable branches. Some were simply abandoned, others rail-banked in the Rails to Trails program, and finally the remainder were leased or sold to public or private short-line operators. In the Tennessee Valley, the L&N was particularly aggressive. TVA recognized that the loss of freight rail service was going to be devastating for rural communities and small industries and would further limit their economic development potential. So a technical assistance program was established to help local areas form public rail authorities to own and operate the lines. Low-cost loans were provided for acquisition, and TVA made surplus rail equipment available for low-cost leases. For decades, TVA had used leases of surplus property to promote economic and community development. Surplus computers, office furniture, vehicles, fire trucks, recreation equipment, and so on, were regularly leased to nonprofits and local agencies to support their programs for a nominal fee, usually $1 per year. Everything was marked with a small brass tag saying, "Property of U.S. TVA." In late 1980, TVA had assisted in the formation of the South Central Rail Authority in Middle Tennessee. A no-interest loan was provided for the acquisition of the L&N line from Dixon to Hohenwald, and 3 1940 surplus switch engines were leased to them for $1 per year. 4 years later, I was managing TVA's Economic and Community Development Program in Middle Tennessee when GSA audited the TVA surplus property program. They determined that TVA was not in compliance and ordered that lease tag property must be located and accounted for. Leases were required to be current. I sent a staff member down to meet with the rail authority. 2 switchers were immediately located, tag numbers noted, $6 collected for the renewed 3-year leases, but the 3rd switcher was missing. The rail authority had recently contracted with a new short line operator, and no one knew anything about the missing locomotive. I reported the missing engine to the GSA. They were not happy. Realized then that these things were really junk and no spare parts were available. I asked the GSA to let us write it off, and after all the lease revenue was only $1 per year, and the scrap value was the most you could get at an auction. They insisted we find it. I took 5 people down. We went to Hohenwald and high-railed the branch line, inspecting every siding, industrial lead, and yard track, and still no sign of the missing locomotive. 3 years later, in 1987, I was working on the TVA industrial development staff, and I was trying to find potential industrial sites in Middle Tennessee, including the Hohenwald area. Harry McClure, one of my former Nashville staff, and I got the TVA helicopter, and we were looking for sites when we spotted something strange in the middle of a pine plantation about 6 miles east of Hohenwald. I asked the pilot to set us down in a small opening. There was the missing switcher, sitting on one small section of remaining track. It had been heavily cannibalized and was totally and completely, permanently disabled. The 3-mile lead track to the former sawmill site had been abandoned, and the track bed was barely visible in the forest and underbrush. I called surplus property and told them that we found their engine and described the situation. Shortly afterward, I received a call from the GSA. The guy was a real bureaucratic jerk. He said it was still government property and I had to recover it. I told him, well, now I have a different job, not my responsibility, but as a courtesy, I'll look into it. This thing weighed tens of thousands of pounds and was miles away from a rail line or yard, or road for that matter. Only a huge freight helicopter had any chance of moving it, and that was going to cost a fortune. I reported back to the GSA guy, who said that the rail authority had to pay for the recovery. Shaking my head, I told him that was ridiculous and not going to happen. Finally, I suggested that we either lease the engine to the rail authority in perpetuity for $1, or since it had a negative surplus value as scrap given its recovery costs, bid list it whereas as is, and the authority could pay a nominal sum, say $10. The GSA could accept the bid, no one would then have to do anything, and the books would be clear. He insisted on payment of the $5 back rent, but agreed to the sale. Everyone agreed to my proposal, and it settled for a total of $15. A month later, the GSA called and said we had to recover the brass property tag from the locomotive, since it was no longer government property. Poor old Harry McClure had to slog 5 miles one way through the brush and pine forest in August with a hammer and a screwdriver to pry the tag off. To the best of my knowledge, the derelict locomotive carcass remained stranded in a pine forest in the middle of nowhere, Tennessee. And, well, thus ends this sad tale of absurd bureaucratic woe. Thank you.